All right, let's get talking about the ones within your EQ spectrum. 1 hertz we are not concerned with because it's something that we're not even going to be able to hear anyway, and it's below our hearing spectrum. 10 hertz, same idea. Our next numbers that we're going to find with ones that are significant would be 100 hertz, 1 kilohertz, and 10,000 hertz or 10 kilohertz. Let's talk about those 3 frequency spectrums, and let's jump in. So using the sine wave that I was using before on this analog simple synthesizer where we just have a sine wave and nothing else happening, I'm going to play some low sub frequencies and move up until we hit about 100 hertz. Let's check it out. Watching here, you can see this is our 100. Keep listening. Right around here, you might be able to hear it on most systems, but by the time we hit 100 hertz, which is this G in this case, or we're really close to 100 hertz, this is where we're going to start to hear bass frequencies even on smaller speakers. So I would say around 100 hertz, it's good to think of this as sort of bass territory. Now, when I'm applying any sort of EQ moves to bass, generally I would be working with a shelf. I'm working with this sort of EQ as opposed to something that looks like this, which would be a parametric band. Thank you, George Massenburg, the producer of Earth, Wind & Fire, who gave us this particular type of EQ alteration. So if we're at 100 hertz, a really common way to think about this is when you're in your car and you have bass and treble as 2 things that you can affect in terms of what you're hearing, when you're affecting the bass, it's probably set at around 100 hertz and you're simply adding or subtracting as a shelf. This is going to also influence these sub frequencies down below, but it's going to be a very even blend of bass and sub being added together. Let's listen to it. It sounds something like this. Now, you have to be cautious because adding to this area can add a lot of hype and it can sound really cool, but I don't want big, huge, boomy sounds coming out of my headphones so that I feel like I'm in the club. I need to understand these headphones. I need to understand my speakers, my car, wherever else I'm listening and referencing my mix. So a lot of people will get caught in this area of adding way too much down here. This is where I like to use visualizers to help me understand what my sub and bass information is looking like and how it's going to translate to other systems. Also, I don't keep my subwoofer on all the time. So what I'll do is I'll get my mix as good as I can, and then I'll flip on the sub and listen to it balanced all together. And then I'll even turn off my speakers and just listen to the sub by itself to make sure that the kick and the sub bass are working well together and as a little sub mix feel appropriate. It might even at that point be worth listening to a reference mix, hear how their mix sounds just in the sub, and then reference that back to how my mix sounds. Now, the truth is for this mix, I think our low end is feeling fine. When you pull this up, right, we have a lot of hype, and then when you pull it down, it feels thin, but you have to make sure that when you make these moves, you let your ears adjust a little bit, especially when there's a lot of hype and you take away the hype. It might sound dull or it might sound like there's some energy lost, but take a little break, come back, listen again, and you might find that things are really well balanced. So here we are, too much hype. And again, it feels like it loses that energy, but this is relatively well balanced before we go into any mastering. I get clients that sometimes will join me as I'm co-producing with them, mixing or mastering, and quite often they'll ask for more bass frequencies. But I try to explain to them using these visualizers that the bass is actually well in check. I'll turn on the big speakers, I'll turn on the sub, and you hear straight away that things are really well balanced. There's tons of low end, but when you're mixing on smaller speakers or mixing with your sub turned off, you might get tricked into adding a little bit too much down in this area. So this is 100 hertz. I'm not saying you can't use a parametric band down around this area. I especially use it for scoops at around this spot or this spot, depending on how my kick and bass are working together. But it's one of those things where if you start with a shelf, you'll have a pretty solid starting point and really hear what's happening down in this bass territory and everything below, which would be your sub territory. So that is 100 hertz. Now we're up to 1,000 hertz, and this is where the sort of the music is in the mids. 1,000 hertz tends to be where you're going to find your mid frequencies really poke out. I like to do wide brush strokes around this area. If you start to do something like this, you're going to get these little resonant peaks. Just listen to the difference. Hear that, right? If I do something like this, Now it feels like I'm just shifting those mids a bit higher and lower and playing around with colors. So as a starting point, when you're EQing, I don't want you doing a lot of this stuff, right? Really high, really narrow peaks. You can do some attenuations that are quite narrow, especially for like your, let's say, working with a violin and there's a harsh ring to it, then you might want to pull out that ring. But for now, especially in these mid frequencies, I want you to make sure that you're doing wider brush strokes. Let's listen and see if we can benefit from adding a little bit of this within our mix. Let's check it out. I think that definitely does help bring a little bit more clarity to those mids. So we're going to play around with keeping that on for a little bit, but that is 1000 hertz. It's the mids, and do some wide brush strokes. A little can go a long way because we're also bleeding up into that 3 kilohertz sensitive ear sort of territory. Lastly, we have 10 kilohertz, 10,000 hertz. Again, when you're up in this area, which is this line right up here, what I would recommend is that, again, you play around with a shelf. And this is going to add airiness and a little bit of clarity, sometimes digitalness, to the mix. If you pull it down, it might sound a little more analog or subdued or soft. Let's listen. Now this is another area where when you have it hyped up for a while and you pull down, like let's say it's overhyped and you pull down, it's going to feel dull. So you want to make sure, again, for these extremes, way down low and way up high, I like to use visualizers to help confirm, but also switching between 2 types of headphones, 3 different speaker systems. I'm moving all over the place to make sure that things sound good. I know my Genelecs are a little bit bright, and I know my Yamahas are a little bit dull. So I like to cut the difference between these types of juxtaposed speaker systems. Let's say my mix sounds a little bit bright on the Genelecs and a little bit dull on the Yamahas. That's actually the sweet spot for me. But if it sounds very bright on the Genelecs, my smaller speakers, and it sounds perfectly bright on the Yamahas, then I'm probably too bright. Vice versa, if it sounds very dull on the Yamahas and kind of dull on the Genelecs, it's probably too dull. Now, I tend to err on the side of caution of being a little too dull in these high frequencies because, again, on some big speaker systems, things can get a little bit overly bright, but I'm not saying intentionally make your mixes dull. This is just more of a stylistic thing for me. What I'll find is that a couple of my instruments will have a pretty significant peak up around this area, and then everything else is going to feel a little bit flat or deadened to make those elements really poke out. Let's say it's the airiness of vocals and the nice top sheen of some hi-hats. That might be all I really want to be occupying some of this extreme 10 kilohertz and above territory, whereas other elements I might not want to boost. Now, I promise you that almost every instrument that you boost, if you do one of these, it'll sound a little bit better, but you don't want to overdo it. If every instrument is occupying that territory, then essentially they're all combating for your ear's attention up in that spot. So think of this 10 kilohertz as airiness, adding a little bit of clarity and adding a bit of a digital sheen. So that's it for the ones. We have 100 hertz, think bass territory, and generally use a shelf. We have 1000 hertz or 1 kilohertz, think mids, and generally boost a little bit wide. And then up top, we have 10 kilohertz or 10,000 hertz. Again, this is airiness, digital sheen. It's going to give you a little bit more clarity, but you don't want to be adding this to every instrument. Although it sounds quite nice, make sure you're selective with which instruments you want to poke out in this top area. Ones are a great way to just think lows, mids, and highs. And you can even see on the EQ, they've outlined this 100 hertz, they've outlined this 1 kilohertz, and they've outlined this 10 kilohertz. They are great starting points to get thinking of these low, mids, and highs. So make sure that you're really watching out for these ones. The reason I showed you threes first is I think they're more cautionary spots, whereas the ones are maybe a little bit more fundamental in terms of memorizing these sweet spots. So that's it for this class on the ones. In our next class, we're going to talk about clippers. I'll see you there.